Hello fellow sign lovers, you have been waiting way too long for this one, so let's start with the first diagram. So here is the first diagram, and as you can see there are three arrows. So there are the arrows of perception, action and habit. And I think some of you may instantly recognize that these arrows correspond with the three categories. So the yellow arrow of perception corresponds with firstness, so roughly. The red arrow of action corresponds with secondness, and the third arrow of habit corresponds with thirdness. There is also this circle over here that represents the boundaries of some system, but for now on you can leave it be. We're gonna discuss it more in the upcoming videos. In this video we are mainly gonna discuss the three arrows as they are. So let's start with the first arrow, the arrow of perception, which corresponds to firstness. So this is the experience of perception. So how the world manifests to you, how you sense the world, how you perceive your surroundings. That is what this arrow is representing. Then there is the arrow of action over here, and that of course means action, how you act on your environment. And maybe the simplest example is all of your basic movements, but also something like thoughts, which can be seen as mind actions, fall into this category. Now, before we move to the third arrow, I want to discuss one very important thing in this diagram. Now you can see that perception and action form this kind of a feedback cycle. We may call this perception-action cycle. So what this means is that perception and action happen in a continuous movement. There is no causation between them, so to say. But by that I mean that we don't first perceive and then act. Rather, we are perceiving and acting continuously, basically at the same time, all of the time. For example, consider driving a car. When you're driving a car, you are both perceiving, the traffic around you, and acting by doing various kinds of movements that control the car. There is no meaningful separation between perception and action in a causal way, that we could say that at this moment you're perceiving and at that moment you're acting. Rather, you are perceiving and acting both at the same time. It's a continuous cycle of perception action. And then there is the third arrow, the arrow of habit. Now, this habit controls all of your actions. When you do something, you do so based on some habit. You can see it by how this arrow leads into action. So, for example, let's take that car example once more. You are moving your body parts in a way that control the car, but you are not conscious of those movements because those are very habitual movements. So in other words, these habits determine, control and guide your actions when you're driving a car. That's why this arrow of habit is above the arrow of action, and you can see how it, in a sense, leads into action and guides it. So this means that all kinds of habits are continuously flowing into your perception action cycle. And that is something I want to really emphasize here. This diagram is not static. Rather, it's continuously moving and flowing. There is no static states. It's a continuous movement where this cycle is rotating and these habits are all of the time flowing into that cycle, determining actions. Now let's take some examples to learn the diagram. So in this first example, you're gonna hear a knock on the door. So the knock itself is, of course, as a sound, a certain kind of perception. You perceive the sound of this knocking. Now your action is to go and open that door. So you perceive the knock and you go and open up that door. That's your action. This is your perception action cycle. When you hear a knock on the door, you go and open the door. Now this habit is what is guiding your action. So you have a habit of opening the door when you hear a knock on the door. Now, for example, a small child does not have this habit. So when a child hears a knock on the door, he or she may not go to the door because he or she does not understand what this knock means or knocking sound means. So the child does not have this habit that would guide the action of opening a door. Let's take another example. This time you hear the word dog. A very familiar example on this channel. So the word dog is of course a sound. It's a certain kind of perception. You perceive the sound. And this time the action is your mind action. That is how you picture in your head a dog. That's your action. So you perceive the sound dog and immediately you picture yourself a dog. Now again, habit is guiding all of this. So you have learned the habit that the sound dog means dogs. So you have this habit that guides your individual mind action here and now that calls into your mind a picture of a dog. You understand what I mean. Now again, we can use the example of a small child. A small child does not have this habit. The small child hasn't learned that the sound dog means dogs. So a child does not have the same mind action of picturing a dog that you have. So again, it's very important how these habits guide and determine various kinds of actions. And in this example, that action is a mind action, a thought. One more thing about this diagram. You can see that there are, in a sense, two layers in this one. There is the perception action layer, and then there is this habit layer. Now, what that means is that we can directly perceive this perception action cycle. When you, for example, hear some sound or see something, that something is immediately perceivable. It's actualized. And when you do something, when you act something out, that action is also immediately perceivable. It's concrete. But these habits are not immediately perceivable. They are not concrete. So basically, this is the distinction between existence and reality. I have discussed this in another previous video. Check that out if you haven't. But basically, we can say that these habits that guide our actions are not immediately perceivable. Now, for example, if you're driving a car, we can perceive what you do. We can monitor what you do. We can track your body parts and all of that. But we cannot immediately see your habits themselves, habits in themselves that guide your actions. All we can see are instances of habits or individual manifestations of those habits. So we have the habit, which is not perceivable, and then we have the individual actions that those habits determine and guide, which are perceivable. But this habit stays, in a sense, there on the background, and we have to infer that habit. Or we may take gravity as an example. Now, when I drop something, that something falls to the ground, obviously. So we can perceive an action happening. That action is that falling down of that object. But we cannot perceive the law of gravity in itself, which is a habit. So all that we can see are instances of that law of gravity. So we can only perceive those individual things falling down, whereas the habit or the law of gravity is something that we have to infer from those individual instances. So this is the quick sort of a sneak peek into the diagram. There is a lot more to say about this, but I'm gonna leave it to next videos. I want to keep these videos very short so that we don't get any information overloads, which is quite usual to my videos. So hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, leave them below in the comments, and I see you soon with the next video on this diagram. So good sign hunting.